Okay, I've started the recording. Remember that your exam is next time. Remember, we have a totally different schedule for the day of the exam. You should know by now when you are scheduled to take it. Some of you, you'll be taking at 11, some at 12:30, some at 2, some at 3:30. So be sure to come when you're scheduled to take it. If you haven't contacted me yet, you really should do that today. And I will send out an email tomorrow that will tell you where to go. All of the rooms are in this building, but they're only the 11 o'clock exam will be given in this particular room. Did you have a question? Okay, good. Good. All right, today we're going to finish up talking about supply and demand. It's a very important framework. If you are seeing it for the first time and it seems confusing, that's absolutely okay. That means you're thinking and you're recognizing, I don't really understand this. And that's what happens to most people. If you're confused, that doesn't mean something is going wrong. That just means you have to keep going. You have to keep thinking about it. A lot of times I'll see people who will, they have a problem at work and they just stare at it and say, I don't know what to do. You got to start by taking a step. You start by following the process you use to get the answer. Even if you're not sure what to do, you think, well, what do I think I probably should do? And you do that. And then you see what happens. And a lot of times you do the first step, and you do the second step, and before you know it, you're done. And you weren't sure if you were doing it right, but you have to go ahead and try. And with supply and demand analysis, the first step is always the same. What's the first step in supply and demand analysis? What do you see on the board? A supply and demand graph.
Draw the graph.
Supply and demand graph. The first step is the easy step. It's the step that people often skip because they're not really sure that that's going to lead them to the right answer. I'm telling you, it is. When you're doing a supply and demand problem, read the question and then draw a graph, and then use the graph to figure out what the answer is. Do not expect to read the question and immediately say, oh, I know the answer. You're not supposed to do that. You're supposed to use the analysis to reason to the right answer. And that takes some time. If you're doing supply and demand questions and you're not drawing graphs, you're doing it wrong. You're doing it wrong. That's the most important thing. Draw a graph when you're dealing with those kinds of questions. And I may have talked to you before about this, I don't remember, but there's a concept in psychology called overlearning, where you work on something, you figure it out, and then you keep doing it. You keep practicing it until it becomes second nature. One of the big problems people have in economics is that they work on it until they say, oh, I think I'm getting it. I've got it. And then they go on to something else. And if that's where you stop on the exam, you're going to get confused. But if you overlearn it, if you keep working these problems, and learning curve allows you to keep doing that, that will give you the practice that you need. If you work on these problems for long enough so that you're starting to think this is boring, it's not that hard, then when you get through the exam, you will think this is not that hard. So keep going until you can you have confidence that you can work through the questions correctly. Today we're going to finish up talking about equilibrium. We just barely introduced that last time. And then we will go through a number of examples to show how you use this analysis. And as I go through it, your goal is not to remember the answer I got. Your goal is to remember and know how to use the process I use to get the answer. Because on the exam, it will not have exactly the questions we're going to talk about today, but it will have a number of questions that require the process we're going to be using. If you know how to use that process, you will get those answers, those questions right. Okay. Overview for supply and demand for just a moment. Remember, we said in a market economy, questions about scarcity, about what are we going to produce, who's going to get it, those questions are answered by the price mechanism. If there's not much of something, and people want a lot of it, the price is going to go way up. Right? People who are willing to pay that high price, they're going to get it. People who aren't going to get it. So prices, we said, are extremely important in a market economy. So we need to know, well, where do prices come from? Producers don't just pick them out of a hat. They're not arbitrary. In a competitive market with lots of producers, lots of consumers, the price is not set just by what the producer wants to charge or what the consumer wants to pay. The price is determined by the interaction of all the consumers and all the producers. And you may end up with a price that nobody likes. The price may be one that consumers say, this is way too high, I want to pay less. And the producers may say, this is way too low, we should get more. So the price that you reach isn't necessarily the one anybody wants, but the competitive process will push us to that equilibrium. And that's what we're going to continue talking about at the beginning today. Any questions? When you have a question, feel free to ask. And after class, as you are working on these things, remember the way to study is to draw the graphs, work through the questions with a graph. Simply staring at the graph is not productive. That's not the way you learn how to use it. It is the way a lot of people study, but it's not very effective. You have to draw the graph and think through what's happening. And you get stuck on something, you say, I don't know what to do on this problem, then give me a call. I'll be happy to work through it with you.
On the test, will we be drawing these out?
On the test, you should be drawing these out. That's right. We'll have a paper test. Some of the questions will have a graph for you, but some won't have a graph, but they do deal with supply and demand. So if it deals with supply and demand, you should draw a graph on the page. The graph helps you. It's a tool that leads you to the right answer. All right, so we're saying the price will not necessarily be what anybody wants. Somehow Adam Smith's invisible hand is going to push us to a particular price in a given market. We want to understand how that works. Well, think about what we said about demand. We said that demand curve summarizes consumer behavior. It's negatively sloped. That negative slope reflects the law of demand. The negative slope is telling us that when the price of this product goes down, other things being equal, consumers are going to respond in a predictable way. If something becomes cheaper, what are consumers going to do? They're going to buy more, which means the quantity demanded goes up. And that is simply reflected by the negative slope of the demand curve. For supply, we said producers like a high price. So as the price of the product goes up, other things being equal, the quantity producers will be willing to supply goes up. That's the law of supply. It's a direct relationship between the price that producers can get and the quantity they're willing to produce. Whereas on the demand side, there's an inverse relationship between the price and the quantity. Okay? Those are things you want to be sure you understand. Okay? You want to be sure you understand the difference between a change in demand and just a change in the quantity demanded. Okay? And we'll go through that in just a moment. But let's say here, this is the market for, we'll say it's gas. And let's say the price is up here at, I think we started this last time, $6 a gallon. What we're saying is, let's assume that the price is $6. Right? There's no way to look at this and say, oh, the price will be $6. No, let's say assume that when we start out in this market, at the moment, the price is $6. The question then is, given that the price is 6, and the demand is here and supply is here, what is going to happen? And the results are very predictable. You just have to remember, what do you need to do? You start with the price you're given. You read horizontally over to the demand curve. You read vertically down to the axis. That gives you the quantity demanded. Not the demand, but the quantity demanded. That's the number of units consumers will want to buy at that price. Let's say it's 80,000 gallons. What do we do now? What's the next step? We say, well, at that, if the price is $6, what will producers want to do? So we read over horizontally, assume that's a straight line there, to the supply curve, and then we read down to the axis, and that gives us the quantity supplied. That tells us how much the producers will want to sell. They'll be willing to sell that much at that price. They like the high price, so they're willing to sell a large quantity, let's say 200,000. So we started with the assumption price is $6. Then we worked to, well, what will the quantity demanded be? What will the quantity supplied be? Then we asked, how do they compare? Obviously, they're not the same thing. Quantity supplied is greater than quantity demanded. And when we have that condition, we call that a surplus or excess supply. And then we ask, is this what we want? Do we want producers producing a whole lot more than consumers are going to buy? Well, obviously, nobody wants that. The consumers don't benefit from it. The producers don't benefit. This is a problem. This is a coordination problem. The producers are doing something different from what the consumers want. Okay? And given that nobody is running this show, nobody's telling people what to do, it's not surprising that this can happen. What's important is that when we do have a surplus like this, the price mechanism begins to function and to solve the problem. You don't have to have somebody in government figure out, oh, we've got a surplus, and tell producers you need to cut back or to produce less, and tell consumers when you should buy more. We don't need government to do anything here except enforce the law. Like, don't steal from people. Okay? And if in this situation, because producers have a surplus, they can't sell all that they're trying to produce. They ask the question, how do we get rid of this surplus? How do we motivate people to buy more? Well, what's the answer? Lower the price. Lower the price. And as the price goes down, that is the price mechanism beginning to function. And the lower price is sending a signal to consumers. It's saying it's okay to use more, and it's giving them an incentive to use more. And so the quantity demanded begins to increase. Likewise, the lower price is sending a signal to the producers. They are getting the message, we don't need to produce as much. Consumers don't want this much. And it gives them an incentive to cut back and not produce as much. So as the price is falling, consumers are moving down along their demand curve. Producers are moving down along the supply curve. As the price is falling, what is happening to that surplus? It's getting smaller, right? Because quantity demanded and quantity supplied are getting closer together. And once we get to the equilibrium, which will always be at the intersection, then quantity demanded and quantity supplied will be exactly the same. The producers are, in total, are producing the amount that consumers in total want produced. Well, obviously that's a good outcome. We don't want too much produced. We don't want too little produced. We want a balance between the two. And that's exactly where we end up, even though there's nobody trying to get us there. The government didn't do anything. The producers, they're not trying to get us to equilibrium. What are the producers trying to do? They're trying to make profit for themselves and the consumers. What are you trying to do when you go to the gas station? Trying to get the gas you want at the lowest possible price. So there is nobody trying to get us to equilibrium, but that is exactly where we end up. That is the unintended consequence of allowing people to pursue their own self-interest. That's what Adam Smith was talking about with the invisible hand. So we started out with an imbalance, but we see that that imbalance is going to be eliminated as the price adjusts. And we could go through, we could say, well, what if the price were down here? Let's say the equilibrium is $3 per gallon. Would it be good for the price to be $1 a gallon? Would producers like that? No, they wouldn't make much profit. Would consumers like that? Consumers would like paying $1 per gallon if they can get the gas they want. But if we think about it, this is a $1 per gallon price is not going to be good for consumers, because we have to ask, if the price is here, what is actually going to happen? What are the consumers going to do? What are the producers going to do? And so we say, well, if it's $1, how much will the producers be willing to supply? Well, we get that by reading over to the supply curve. And let's say the new quantity supplied is, let's say it's 100,000 gallons. What do we do next? We look at consumers. What are they going to want to do at that price? So we read over to the demand curve, and let's say the new quantity demanded is 180,000. Right? Is this the same situation we had before? We've got an imbalance, but it's not the same. It's flipped. Right? Before, producers were producing more than consumers wanted to buy. Now, quantity demanded is greater than quantity supplied. That's a shortage or excess demand. And think about what that means. The real danger with supply and demand analysis is that you just look at it as a graph. Just a two-dimensional thing that doesn't really mean anything. What you want to do is learn to look at that two-dimensional graph and then think about, in the real world, what does this tell us is going on? And what this is telling us is, if the price is $1, you're going to have producers making available a relatively small amount, you're going to have consumers wanting almost twice as much. So you're going to have a shortage. You're going to have lots of consumers who say, I've got the money, I've got my dollar, I want gas, but there's no gas available. Okay, question? Yeah, there's a fly, I think, here. So this is not going to be good for consumers. They like the low price, but you know, what if Mercedes? What if the government said the price of a Mercedes will now be $1? Would that be great for consumers? I don't think so.
Yes.
How many Mercedes would be available at a price of $1 per car?
None.
None. Whether they're obviously the new ones wouldn't be available, but used ones. Even if you got 4 cars and you don't really need your 5th car, which is a Mercedes, if you can only sell it for $1, you're going to keep it. Right? So a low price isn't good for consumers unless they can actually buy the product at that price. It's one of the most important things to learn about supply and demand. Low price, arbitrarily low prices aren't good for consumers. The footnote, when you hear politicians say, we're going to give you free health care, we're going to give you free education, we're going to give you free computers, you should be rather suspicious that things aren't going to turn out the way you're being led to believe they will. But anyway, here, if the price is $1, very little will be available. Consumers want a lot. That gap there, the difference between quantity demanded and quantity supplied, is a shortage. When there's a shortage, what's going to happen? What will the producers think about? Raising. They're going to think about raising the price. I'm sorry, go ahead. The producers, they're trying to make profit, and they spend a lot of time thinking about how can I make profit. And as soon as they start to think there's going to be a shortage, they're going to start thinking about raising the price. And as the price goes up, this is just the flip side of the price mechanism working before. As the price goes up, that is a signal to consumers, gas is more scarce than you thought, you really need to use less. And it gives them an incentive to use less, because as the price goes up, it becomes much more painful to fill up your tank. So the quantity demanded goes down.
Excuse me, Mr. Jones? It's Kayla. I was just wondering, economically, what is the impact of raising like minimum wage?
The minimum wage is an example of a price floor, which is related to what we have here. I don't want to spend much time on it, but I'll just give you the bottom line. When you have a price floor, when the government keeps the price above the equilibrium, you're going to have a surplus. And that's what happens with the minimum wage. The minimum wage creates a surplus of workers, which means the unemployment rate will be higher than it otherwise would have been. A lot of people want to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour. Well, if that's going to help workers, why be stingy? Let's raise it to $100, $300 an hour. Then we'll all be high-income people, right? We'll all be unemployed. Minimum wage is an example of a price floor, which is dealt with in Chapter 8, but you can pretty much see what the results would be from basic supply and demand here. So if we start out where the price is below equilibrium, price is going to automatically go up. Consumers cut back and they start buying less. Likewise, producers have an incentive to produce more. So they start to increase the quantity they supply, and that distance here, which was the amount of shortage, as the price goes up, quantity supplied and the quantity demanded are getting closer and closer together. This process continues until we get to the equilibrium, which is here, where the quantity supplied and the quantity demanded are exactly equal. This is what supply and demand analysis is all about. Price of the product in a competitive market is not set simply by what somebody wants to charge. It is determined by where the demand curve and the supply curves intersect each other. And if we're not in that equilibrium initially, there are automatic adjustments that will begin and will push us to that equilibrium. Okay? Now, a couple of things to point out. Let's say that the equilibrium quantity is 130. Just to make up a number. We know it's somewhere between 100 and 180. Let's say it's 130. When the price, if I gave you this graph, said the price is currently is $6. Tell me about this market. What can you say about this market if the price is $6? Is it in equilibrium? No. Okay. Do we have a shortage or a surplus? We have a surplus, and what is the amount of the surplus?
$3.
Well, the amount of this, important point to make here, don't get confused between a surplus and consumer surplus. Okay? Unfortunately, those are very similar terms, very easy to confuse, okay? But they are totally separate things. Consumer surplus and producer surplus have to do with what is the total gain the consumer is getting. If I buy a cup of coffee for $2 and I was willing to pay $6, then I'm getting a $4 consumer surplus on that. But we're not talking about consumer surplus here. We're talking about a market surplus. We're talking about the difference between the quantity supplied and the quantity demanded. So go back to the question, if the price is $6 per unit, told me there's going to be a surplus, what is going to be the amount of that surplus? Let's see, this point went down to 80. This point went over to 200. The equilibrium is 130. On the exam, the graphs won't be that messy. How much is the surplus?
Is it 80?
50 is one of the most popular answers, but it's not correct. That's why you really want to put a star by this, because people often miss a question like this. It's very easy. The amount of the surplus is the difference between the quantity supplied and the quantity demanded. So you say, well, what is the current price? You read over to the demand curve. You find the quantity supplied, and it was, or quantity demanded, I'm sorry, and it was 80. At the current price, you read over to the supply curve. You find the quantity supplied, it was 200. The amount of the surplus is the difference between the quantity supplied and the quantity demanded. So that's 200 minus 80 is 120. Right? This gap there, that's the amount of the surplus, and that is 120 units. The mistake that people often make, and they make it because they're reading the graph very quickly, they will look at the quantity supplied and then they look at the equilibrium. Okay? And they'll say, okay, this amount minus that amount. So that's the surplus. No. You always look at what is the current price. And at that price, what is the quantity demanded? What is the quantity supplied? That difference is the amount of the surplus. Same thing would be true for if you have a shortage. If the price is $1, are you in equilibrium? No. What do you have? You're going to have a shortage because the quantity demanded is greater than the quantity supplied. The shortage is that horizontal gap, okay? And the amount is going to be, let's see, the quantity demanded, I believe I said was 180. Quantity supplied was 100. So the amount of the shortage would be 80. Okay? When you're trying to determine what is the amount of a shortage or surplus, you don't look at the equilibrium. Okay? You look at what are the quantities at the current price. Okay? If you remember that, that will help you a lot. Okay? All right, this is the basic model. Okay? The whole purpose of the model is to figure out what the price of what determines the price of the product, and to be able to use this model to determine what will be the effect of various things that occur. We identified a number of shift factors for demand. We identified a number of shift factors for supply. You need to know those, you need to understand those, and be able to, if one of those things happen, use the model to figure out which curve is going to shift, what will happen to the price, what will happen to the quantity. Okay? And so now we're going to go through some examples. But before we do that, any questions on this basic idea? Having this down is so important, because all the other things we do become easy if you understand the basic model. I'd encourage you, try to explain it to somebody else. You can explain it to them. That's a really good sign. If you really can't say anything, that's a sign you need to keep working. I've had students I'll help in my office, back when I could use my office, and I would explain this very thing, say, do you understand that? Yeah, I got it. Makes sense. I've got it now. Okay, explain it to me. And they can't say the first word. So you got to test yourself. Can I explain it? And if you find you can't, like I said, give me a call or an email, and I'll try to help you with that. Okay. Examples. Let's say this is the market for fast food. Okay? So it's a big city, you've got lots of restaurants, lots of consumers, highly competitive market, let's say. Say the price of a hamburger is $3. And a number of restaurants in this city, they decide, we're not making it. They go out of business. We call that exit from the market. So if we have an exit from the market, we have producers who are choosing to go out of business, how would we represent the effect of that in this graph? We've done the first step, you draw a graph. Second, you look at the graph and say, well, is this something that has a direct effect on supply or something that has a direct effect on demand? Because the answer to that question is to tell which curve is going to shift. Okay? If you have, or one way to think about this is go back to your list of factors that will shift each curve. For demand, one of the factors was population. you get more people, that means more consumers, demand would shift to the right. If you have exit from the industry, you have firms going out of business, fewer firms, does that mean you're going to get more output or less output? You're going to get less. I just think about it. What if all the firms went out of business? Then supply would shift all the way back to the axis, and there would be no supply. So exit from the industry is a shift factor for supply. Entry into the industry by new firms would also be a shift factor, but it would shift it in the other direction. So let's say that the quantity supplied initially is 200,000 hamburgers per day. That's the total, all the restaurants in this city, let's say. Now some of these restaurants go out of business. If you have fewer restaurants, then fewer hamburgers are going to be supplied. This would shift the supply curve to the right or up. Think of it, it's really doing both. Okay? And that's a decrease in supply because for any given price, the quantity that will be supplied is now going to be smaller than before. Initially, if the price were $3, then all of these restaurants together would be willing to provide 200,000 hamburgers. But if 10% of the restaurants go out of business, well, they're not going to be willing to supply as much because you don't have as many producers. Okay? So the whole curve is shifting to the right. Also, it's shifting up. Think of it either way. Our first step was to draw a graph. Second step, figure out the event that occurred. Is this going to shift demand or supply? We said it's going to shift supply. We said it's going to decrease supply. We drew in the new curve. The last step is to figure out, well, what's going to happen to the price and quantity. And are we going to remain here at $3?
No.
$3 is not the equilibrium price anymore. As far as the consumers are concerned, okay, they don't care what's happened. Okay? If the price is $3, they still want 200,000 hamburgers. But producers, if the price were at that level, are only willing to supply, let's say, 100,000. So if the price remained at $3, what would we have? Shortage or surplus? We'd have a shortage of how much? 100,000 hamburgers. And when you have a shortage in a free market, automatically the price starts to go up. So the price is going to go up. Where is it going to go? Well, it's going to go to the new equilibrium. And the new equilibrium will always be at the intersection of the new supply curve and the demand curve. So our last step is to look at the graph and say, what was the effect on price? Well, the price started at 3, and now it's going to end up at some higher level, maybe $4. And what happens to the quantity? Well, it was 200,000. The quantity is now going to be at the new equilibrium. And we don't know what it'll be exactly, but let's say it's 160,000. So our conclusion, the price was pushed up and the quantity went down. Okay? And what caused this? This was caused by a decrease in supply. A leftward shift of the supply curve. Okay? Now, in this problem, did the demand for hamburgers change?
No.
demand for hamburgers did not change. If you're not sure, count the curves. How many demand curves you have? One. The demand did not change. What did change?
Supply.
Supply changed, which means supply shifted. You got two supply curves, so you know it shifted. So supply changed, and quantity demanded changed. It is absolutely true that people are going to buy fewer hamburgers now. Right? Quantity demanded went down, but demand did not go down. Also, the quantity supply went down because it started out at 200,000 and it ends up here at 160. Okay? That's just a basic supply and demand problem. You draw the graph, you look at the change that occurred, you figure out which curve shifts, you shift the curve, and then you read the result. Spend most of your time on a question like this thinking about what the question says. Don't focus on the options that you're given, okay? Because if there are 5 options, 4 of them are going to be wrong. Okay? Don't look for an option that sounds good, because if I have done a good job in making up the exam, they will all sound good if you don't know what you're doing. So you spend most of your time reading the question, drawing the graph, working out what's going to happen. And then once you do that, then you look at the options and you say, based on this graph that I drew, which of these is actually going to happen? That's the way to approach these problems. But if you spend most of your time looking through all those options, you are really going to get confused because most of them are not correct. Before I mentioned the additional resources, there's a link on Moodle. There are some practice problems there, and I have some videos that go through and show the process you need to go through. Those can be very tedious because I go through it very slowly and I say, a lot of people do this, don't do this. Other people do this, don't do that. And I say what you should do. So it will take you a while to go through them. But I really think it would be worth your time to do that, especially if this is not making sense to you. All right, any questions here?
Would you mind repeating the steps?
Yeah, or no, I wouldn't mind. First thing first you read the question carefully. You draw the graph. I would say go back and reread the question because you may have misread it the first time. You think about which curve is going to shift. Who's directly affected by this? Consumers or producers? Okay? Once you figure that out, then you think, okay, is it going to shift to the right or to the left? Is it an increase or a decrease? Once you figure that out, you draw in the new curve, you observe where the new equilibrium is, and then you compare the new equilibrium to the original equilibrium, and that shows you what happened to the price and what happened to the quantity. Okay? And I would encourage you, when you get through, go back and check your work. It is very easy to make mistakes. And so you should have plenty of time to go through the questions and to check your work. And an important thing you learn from taking economics is how easy it is to generally know what you're doing, but make a mistake. And if you go back and check your work, then you'll catch that mistake. If you work it a second time and you get a different answer, what should you do? You should work it a third time, because you don't know, when did I make the mistake? And you reason through it very carefully. Don't go with which option makes you feel good. Okay? I think a lot of people do that. It's like a certain option, it feels like that's right. No. Trust the graph. We spend a lot of time on this because it will lead you to the right answer. Okay, another example. let's say you have a question that tells you that this is the market for tea, demand for tea, supply of tea, quantity, price of tea. And you're told that the price of sugar has increased substantially. You're asked, is this going to have any effect in this market? And if so, what's the effect going to be? Okay. What's your first step?
Read the question.
Well, read the question, but then you draw, after you read the question, you draw the graph. Okay? And be careful to note what is on each axis. That's one of the common ways people get confused. We're looking at two different products, tea and sugar. So you've got to remember, which market are we looking at here? Okay? This is the market for tea. So this is the quantity of tea. This is the price of tea. We're trying to figure out how will this market be affected by this change in another market. Notice we're not told anything about why the price of sugar changed. It doesn't matter. We can figure out what the impact of this will be in this market. So once you draw the graph, be careful to recognize what variables on each axis. You look at the event that occurred, the price of sugar went up. You look at the market we're looking at, tea, say sugar and tea. What's the possible connection between the two? Okay? You know there must be some connection, or I wouldn't have given you the question. So you look for what is the connection, and you have in your mind the list of shift factors for demand and the list of shift factors for supply, because it's most likely it's going to be on one of those two lists. So what's the connection between sugar and tea? People, not everybody, but generally people who use tea, drink tea, are going to use sugar. So these are two things that consumers tend to use together. And when you realize that, a word should pop into your mind. These two things are what? Complements, not substitutes. They're complements, things that people use together. And then you say, okay, I remember the price of a complement is one of those shift factors for demand. This is going to have a direct impact on the consumer of tea. And so it's going to be the consumer's behavior that's going to change. The producers, they're not using sugar to make tea. The producers will be affected, but only indirectly once the consumers change their behavior. So since this is a shift factor for demand, the demand curve is going to shift. So now you have to ask, well, is it going to shift to the right? It's going to be an increase, or is it going to be a decrease, a leftward shift? So you think, well, what are consumers going to do? Are they going to say, well, sugar costs a lot more than it did before, so I'll drink a lot more tea with that expensive sugar? No, that's not what they're going to do. What this means is that for tea consumers, the cost of drinking a cup of tea has gone up because the sugar they put into it is now more expensive. Okay? So we can expect that because sugar is more expensive, tea consumers are going to decrease their demand for the product. Let's say the quantity initially was 300,000 cups per day, and let's say the price was 50 cents per cup. Now the price of sugar has gone up. People cut back on the amount of tea they want to buy. And so let's say, we don't know exactly how much they're going to want now, but let's say that If the price remains at 50, then the quantity demanded would be reduced to 200,000. Okay? Compare this point on the demand curve to this point. Okay? This point told us initially tea consumers will demand a quantity of 300,000 at a price of 50. But because of this change that has occurred, their behavior changes. They are not going to want to do this. That point is now replaced by this point. Okay? And this point is a point on an entirely new demand curve for tea. So because the price of a complement, or because the price of one good went up, the demand for this complement has gone down. Okay? And that means the whole demand curve is going to shift to the left. If the price remains at 50 cents, what do we now have? Are we in equilibrium at 50 cents? No. Producers are still very happy to supply a quantity of 300,000. Problem is, consumers are not going to buy that much. They're only going to buy 200,000. So if the price remains at 50 cents, we're going to have what? A shortage or a surplus? A surplus of 100,000 cups. Right? And anytime you have a surplus in a free market, the price is going to start going down. Not because the producers want to help the consumers, because it's in the interest of the producers to cut their price. That's the way that they can get rid of their inventory. So the price starts to go down. As the price goes down, consumers start to buy somewhat more. And producers cut back, and they reduce the amount that they want to, the quantity they want to supply. So we end up at the new equilibrium, somewhere between 200 and 300,000. But we don't know. Let's say it's 255,000. Okay. So to summarize what happened, we would say that because of the increase in the price of this complement to tea, demand for tea went down, the price of tea goes down, and the quantity of tea goes down. Demand for tea decreased. Did the supply of tea decrease? How many supply curves did we do? Just one. So the supply of tea did not change. The quantity supplied changed. The demand for tea changed. Okay? So you would work out a question like this. You would do all of this before looking at the options. Do everything you can to think through the question before you look at the possible answers. Okay? And then once you've done all this, it's just a matter of looking at which of the answers, possible answers, match what actually happened. All right, questions here. Working through a problem like this needs to be second nature. For that to happen, you got to understand the shift factors for both of those two curves. And remember, I did tell you about the 3x5 card, right? Okay, yeah, you can have a 3x5 card, you put whatever you want on it, and probably the shift factors for demand and supply would be a good thing to put on there. All right, next.
I have a question.
Okay.
Is the surplus always in the area where you have that line? Is it always in that area?
Where I have this one?
Yes.
The surplus, it's a really good point to make sure you got clearly in mind. To have a surplus simply means To have a surplus simply means the quantity supplied is greater than the quantity demanded. And the amount of the surplus will just be the difference between those two quantities. And if you're talking about a surplus or a shortage, you have to be talking about what's going to happen at a particular price. So you focus on what's happening at that price and you ignore everything else. So if you had this graph and I said, what is the amount of the surplus if the price was 50 cents, then you would focus on what you have right here. You'd say, okay, 50 cents, read over to demand, this is the quantity. Read over to supply at the same price, read down to the quantity. The difference between those two would be the amount of the surplus. Okay? So we're reading the numbers from down here. What we represented up here is just the horizontal difference between those two. Okay? It works the same way whether you're looking at a shortage or a surplus. All right, what if
Hey, Dr. Jones.
Yeah.
Is there any way you could use COVID tests as an example, or is that too complicated?
Well, no, it would be good to use, there are a lot of applications of COVID here, but I'm not going to do that because it would be somewhat confusing because prices have not been allowed to go up. We're dealing with what happens when you have a truly free market where the price can go wherever equilibrium pushes it. But with crisis situations like a hurricane or COVID-19, there are laws against so-called price gouging, which prevent firms from raising the price to the equilibrium level. Okay? That's a really important thing to understand, but it gets more complicated than the basic stuff we're doing here. So here we're just assuming that there's nothing preventing us from going to equilibrium. We will come back to that some later on. It's a really good application. We would be dramatically better off. Everybody in this country understood this, and if prices had been allowed to go to their equilibrium levels. Okay? If that had happened, you would have never gone to Walmart and found there was no toilet paper or paper towels or handy wipes. That's more complicated. Okay. Let's say that this is the market for housing in San Francisco. I haven't checked lately, but a few years ago, I believe the median price of a house in San Francisco was something like $1.2 million. Rather expensive. Over the last few months, lots of things have happened that have caused lots of people in California, especially in San Francisco, to say, we don't really want to live here anymore. The population of San Francisco is decreasing. So I give you that question. Population in San Francisco is declining. Here's the market for housing in San Francisco. What's going to happen? First you draw the graph, then you think about population. Is this going to have a direct impact on consumers or on producers? And on the supply of housing. And if you have houses are purchased by consumers, by households. If you have people leaving, then you're going to have fewer demanders, fewer home buyers. And so the demand for housing is what is going to shift. And since there are fewer consumers, demand is going to decrease. And So what happens now? The home buyers say, oh, things have changed, so we want to lower our prices. No, they want to sell for the same price as before, but if the price remains at 1.2 million, what's going to happen? What are we going to have? We're going to have a surplus because you've got the same quantity being supplied. Quantity demanded is going to be a lot lower, and that means there's going to be a surplus, which means you got a lot of people trying to sell their houses, but there's no buyer. You're in that position. Do you want to lower your price? No. If you want to sell your house, you have to lower your price. So the price is going to come down. We're going to move to the new equilibrium. Price is definitely going to be lower. The demand for housing has decreased. The supply has not changed, but the quantity supplied has gone down. Okay? Another example, let's say this is the market for pocket calculators. This is the price of pocket calculators. This is the quantity of a particular kind of pocket calculator. When I bought my first pocket calculator, it was $175. That's a long time ago. If you adjust for inflation, that would be closer to around $600. So it was not a cheap calculator. Over the decades, one of the things that has happened is that technology has improved. Producers have found better, cheaper ways to produce the same calculator. So if I tell you, this is where we started, and the change that has occurred is that technology has improved, and as a result, the cost of producing the calculator has gone down. Producers can produce the product at a lower cost than before. I want to know what is going to be the impact in this market. Which curve is going to shift as a result of this technological change? Supply. Producers are going to be very aware of this change. They're trying to make profit. And if their costs have gone down, that means other things being equal, they're going to make more profit. And if they can make more profit, they're willing to supply a larger quantity. So because of this change, supply is going to increase. Notice that demand hasn't changed. Consumers won't even know. They don't know, they don't care. Do you know, think about the things you buy. Do you know what it costs the producer to produce them? No, you don't know, you don't care. Okay? You care about the quality of the product and the price you have to pay. Okay? But the producer knows and he cares. And when his costs come down, he's willing to supply more. So the supply of this product increases. Let's say they were willing to sell 200,000 calculators before. Now, because their costs are lower, if the price remains at 175, let's say, we don't know what it'll be exactly, but let's say it's 350,000. What's going to happen if this is a competitive market? At the original price, consumers still want to buy 200,000, but producers want to sell a lot more. So we've got an increase in supply. There's an increase in the quantity supplied. And so what does this gap represent? It's a surplus. And when we have a surplus in a competitive market, what happens? Price is going to go down. And we're going to end up in the new equilibrium. which is going to be there. Price is going to be lower, let's say 150. And the quantity, it started out at 200,000. The quantity is going to be higher than before, maybe 230. And notice what happens. Or what did we do? We drew the graph, looked at the change that occurred, figured out which curve would shift, which direction it would shift. We drew it in, determined do we have an excess supply or excess demand at the original price, figured out which way the price would go, and then we identified the new equilibrium. Okay? That's the way you work through problems like this. Now, why did the price go down? Was because of supply increase. Is it that the producer said, well, our costs are lower, so we want to help the consumers out and we'll pass those savings on to? No, the producers would have been very, very happy to keep the price up, and then their profit would have gone up a lot. Right? Think about what happens to the producers here. They were trying to make profit. That's why they came up with the new technology. Okay? The new technology increases supply and it pushes the price down. Notice ultimately who benefits from this new technology. It's the consumers. The consumers are ending up getting the benefits of that innovation. The producers were trying to make more profit for themselves, but when you have competition, those savings get passed on to the consumers. Now, in microeconomics, you will talk about markets that are not competitive. What if there are only 4 companies here? And what if those companies could get together? Okay, they might be able to reach an agreement that we'd be a lot better off if we didn't let the price go down. Let's all agree we'll keep the price up, maybe at $170. Okay? There are situations where markets are not competitive and where the firms can benefit from doing something like that. That's illegal. And we won't get into that in chapter 3 and 4. We're simply assuming that the markets are competitive. Prices will go to their equilibrium levels. One more example. What if there's a hurricane out in the Gulf? Price is $2 per gallon. It's in the news. Right? Hasn't done any damage yet. Okay? But you see it. You see it's out there. It's coming toward Louisiana. It's coming toward the oil fields. It's likely to cause the price of oil and the price of gas to go up. What if consumers begin to expect in the near future the price of gas is going to be $7 per gallon? It hasn't happened. What if people think that's going to happen? What are consumers going to do? If I told you this was going to happen, you get up, you leave class, you go try to fill up because you want to buy $2 gas before it goes up to $7 gas. So that is an increase in the demand for gas. And what caused it? It didn't go up because the price went up. No, the price hasn't changed yet. It's expectations. We're saying consumer expectations have changed. And as a result, consumers increase their demand for the product. They want to buy it now before the price goes up. Let's say this happens, you jump in your car, you go to the gas station, and you see the price has already gone up. And you're angry that they're trying they're gouging me. They are charging me a higher price. The hurricane hasn't even hit yet. Why did the price go up? Who caused the price to go up? The consumers, right? Because consumers want more equilibrium, moves to a higher level, let's say $4. It's not something nefarious or evil. It's supply and demand. If consumers want more, that pushes the market, the equilibrium price up. The government has laws against raising the price in this kind of situation. The intention is to help consumers. But notice, if the government says, okay, you can't raise the price above $2 until after this is over, what is that going to lead to? You're going to have a shortage because consumers now want a much larger quantity. Producers are willing to supply this much smaller quantity. If the government keeps the price down, then the government is preventing the price mechanism from functioning, and the government is causing a shortage. The shortage is not caused by the hurricane. The shortage is caused by the government, and the amount of the shortage would be that gap. Okay? Even if the hurricane goes away and doesn't do any damage, you still had this shortage because people expected that it was going to happen. As a result, they changed their behavior. Okay? Here we assume that it was consumers who changed their expectation. If producers were the ones who thought the price was going to go up, you could work through that as well. And under those conditions, it would be supply that would decrease. And again, you would have a shortage. Okay? And if everybody's expecting the price to go up, then you get a really big shortage. All right, if you have questions, let me know. It will be multiple choice. Yeah, it will be multiple choice.
Is there any way that can come for the 11 o'clock class?
Well, now, you won't be taking the, what, I'm sorry, what's your name?
Jocelyn.
Okay, did you send me a time?
I did. I sent you said 12:32 or 2:30, and I sent 2. But I play softball, and I don't have my schedule until Mondays.
Okay,
So I definitely won't have practice at 11, but I could possibly have practice at 2.
okay, email me Monday, probably, I believe right now there's enough room for somebody to take it at 11, an extra person. Because I put the emphasis on getting people to sign up for other times.
So I would pick a different time.
Yeah. I think this. I think you can do it at 11 o'clock.
In here?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think that will work. But
Okay.
then email me and I can confirm it.
Yeah, I should have my schedule by like Monday, Sunday.
Okay.
So I should know.
Okay, that'd be fine.
Thank you.
Dr. Jones, I have a question.
Okay.
So I'm scheduled to take my test at 3:30. Does that mean I will be in room 140?
No. Okay. The times were 12:30, 2, and 3:30.
But I'll still be in the same classroom?
No, they're different classrooms, but they're all in the same building. I'll send out an announcement that will have all the rooms, but they're all in the same building. So, and I'll have it on my door, so it won't be any trouble for you to find your classroom.
Okay. And then for our card, you suggested that we put the shift factors for supply and demand. Like that would be very helpful for the test.
The most important thing is that you really think about what do I need to put on the card, because there may be things that you have trouble remembering that somebody else wouldn't. So it's the shift factors are definitely very, very important. And I would think probably for most people that would be one of the most important things to put on the card. But it's a matter of the things that are important and what do you have trouble remembering. That would be the thing to think about.
Okay, so the cards are pretty much individualized.
Yeah, because it's, you know, some people have trouble with one thing, other people have trouble with something else. So it's just I mean, I can tell you that knowing those shift factors, that's very, very important. So if you think you might have trouble remembering it, then that would probably be a priority thing to put on the list. Also, you know, you can draw graphs. You know, graphs take up more room, but you know, you might want to have, you know, one that shows a surplus and one that shows a shortage. It's just if you think you might get confused about that, then I'd say put that on there. Those are definitely things you need to understand. It's just a question of what's the most important thing for you to have a reminder of. That's the thing.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions?
Yes, I have a question. This is Sharon. The assignments in sapling, are we going to have to know any of those questions that are in sapling?
Well, don't think in terms of what you're going to have to know. Think in terms of the concepts you need to be able to understand and use. Sapling is giving you practice at using those concepts, but there would be, and like I said, the questions are going to be multiple choice formats. So in terms of the format, probably the learning curve questions would be more similar to the exam question format. But all the questions are useful in that they are giving you practice at thinking through these concepts. Okay? So it's always a question of, do I understand how to get the answer, not do I know what the answer is, if that makes sense.
It doesn't, I have another question. It doesn't matter which day do you come? Because I was looking at your announcements and then I was trying to see, like, it doesn't matter which day do you come?
For the exam?
Yes, sir.
Well, for the exam is Tuesday. And if you haven't, okay, the options are I don't have the numbers right now with me as to how many people are signed up for 11 o'clock, but the other options are 2 o'clock, well, 12:30, 2, and 3:30. So send me an email and tell me if you can come at one of those times. And
Okay.
what your preferred time would be. Some people will be able to take it at 11, but I'm trying to keep those open for people who can't do it any other time.
Okay. I think I have to end up taking mine at 11.
Okay, well, just send me an email and tell me that.
Okay. Thank you.
Uh-huh.